Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're doing something a little bit different tonight because tomorrow is the 4th of July and we are not doing a show tomorrow. So you can expect us back with normal programming on Wednesday. But tonight we're going to be talking to a guest for the entire hour. We're doing one of our long form conversations, and this is one I hope you really enjoy. There is a substantial number of people who are part of the 9/11 truther movement. Now, this is a group of people who do not believe the given official narrative about the events of September 11th. And I have to admit that I never looked into this in depth, but I have seen some inconsistencies and oddities that I always thought needed further clarification, like the dancing Israelis, which you can Google and look into if you don't know what that's about. Also, there's a lot of inconsistencies around the collapse of Building 7. Now, many of you know I'm always open to hearing people out and giving their theory a fair shake without bias. And many times they're the ones telling the truth while the establishment and mainstream media lie to us. So today we have with us Ted Walter. He is the executive director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. He was in New York City on 9/11, and he began studying it more in depth since 2006. He worked at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth for 8 years before he helped launch the new organization, which brings together the Journal of 9/11 Studies, the 9/11 Consensus Panel, and the International Center for 9/11 Studies. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation where he breaks down for us what the truth, what from his view, why the official narrative is false, and why the towers and Building 7 were actually taken down through controlled demolition. Now, before we get to our interview, let me tell you about Birch Gold. Many are worried that the dollar may be in trouble. The world is turning away from the U.S. and shoring themselves up to avoid sanctions and other economic fallout. We see OPEC countries banding together, saying they don't want to trade oil only in dollars anymore. So this has many worried about the future of their retirement accounts. And the fact is, there's one asset that has withstood economic upheaval and has a history of being incredibly stable, and that is gold. And you can own it in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold. That's right, Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. And the best part, you don't pay a penny out of pocket. Just visit birchgold.com/Kim for your free info kit. They're going to hold your hand through the whole process. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit on gold. All right. Ted, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kim. It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with this. Obviously, there's an official narrative out there about how the Twin Towers came down, how Building 7 came down, and that is that 2 airplanes struck the 2 Twin Towers, that ultimately the structure couldn't withstand and they collapsed on their own. Then with Building 7, the official narrative, I believe, is that debris from the Twin Towers falling fell onto Building 7, caught fire, and ultimately Building 7 through time could not withstand the heat, that it essentially it caused structural damage, and that building then later collapsed. Is that the official narrative that we know about 9/11?
Yes, that is the official narrative of at least the collapse of the 3 buildings in New York City.
Okay. So what, then tell us are you just thinking that Building 7, because I know there's a lot of people that point to Building 7 and they're always talking about Building 7. So do you believe that just Building 7 was taken out in some other way, or do you think that the Twin Towers also were taken out in some other way?
Yeah, I think that Building 7 and the Twin Towers all 3 buildings were brought down by controlled demolition.
Okay.
And so I can go into that evidence with you.
So let's talk about why you believe what the evidence is. We'll get into the how and the who and all of that a bit later, but why do you believe this was controlled demolition?
Yeah, so let's start with Building 7. Most people haven't seen footage of it. Most people, based on surveys that, groups that I've worked with over the years, can't even name the building. I think it was maybe 1 out of 8 Americans can name Building 7. And if you look at it, it comes down in the exact manner of a controlled demolition. I don't think you can really question that. It comes down symmetrically into its footprint. And once you start looking into this, you'll learn that no steel framed high rise has ever collapsed due to fire, right? And so now we're being told that 3 steel framed skyscrapers are collapsing in one day due to fire. Um,
Can I stop you right there?
what
What do you normally, how do they normally come down if they naturally collapse?
So
What causes it?
skyscrapers, yeah, skyscrapers really don't come down very much. Like you might, if you have a fire, you might have a local structural failure in one little part of the building, maybe a beam drops. If you have an earthquake, a weaker building that's not designed well might tip over. You might get a little bit of a toppling or pancaking of floors, especially of like concrete buildings and so on. But to have a steel framed skyscraper actually completely collapse pretty much has never happened before in itself, besides in the case of controlled demolitions. So
Okay.
pretty much from
And
any cause.
tell us, how tall was Building 7?
Oh man, it's about something like 510 feet, about 47 stories. So it's a very tall building. It would be the tallest building in something like 20 states. You know,
Okay.
it's a very big building.
Building 7. Well, because how tall were the towers, the twin towers? How many floors did they have? They
They
had,
had 110 stories. And they
sorry,
were over 1,000 feet high. Mhm.
you broke up there for just a second. How many floors were they?
Yeah, so the twin towers were 110 stories and something
Okay.
like over 1,000 feet tall.
Got it. And Building 7 was how many stories?
47 stories, so a little
47
under
stories.
half the
Okay.
size.
Okay,
Yeah,
but really tall. I mean, 47 stories is a
very
big,
tall.
big,
Yeah,
tall
imagine
building.
being in front of that's a big, tall building. You stand in
Yeah.
front of it, and you're gonna have to crane your neck to look up and see
And
the
this thing's
top.
made of steel. It's a steel framed building. All three of the buildings were steel framed buildings.
Yes, all three buildings were
Okay.
steel framed. And so
Okay.
what you're seeing when you look at the collapse of Building 7, when it comes straight down, you're actually seeing it in absolute free fall. For the first 2.5 seconds of it's sitting there motionless, and then suddenly at the snap of a finger, it goes into free fall and is in free fall for about 100 feet or 2.5 seconds, right?
Hmm.
And so the only thing that will allow a building to come straight down into its own structure in free fall, which means no resistance whatsoever, is if all of the columns, all the supporting columns in the lower part of the building have been removed. Otherwise, you're just not going to get that clean fall. And in particular, the fact that there was zero resistance, no resistance whatsoever for 8 stories of the building's height.
What would have happened if it was actually natural?
Nothing. I mean, the simplest answer is nothing. Like the story that we've been given about how this collapse occurred, which took them 6.5, 7 years to come up with, um, is a really far fetched story. And it's like, you know, some set of beams pushed this girder off of its seat, and that caused one column to buckle, and then in a matter of seconds, all the rest buckled. If let's say that scenario did actually happen, you would see on the outside of the building a huge amount of deformation happening as those major structural failures are starting to occur. You know, as that column buckles, and then as more and more columns start to fail, you'll start to see the walls of the structure sort of cave in and deform, and then probably, you know, you won't even you know, in an extreme situation, you might get like a part of the building start to tip over a little bit, or like slump down. But the idea that it would drop, like that's just not going to happen. And if you actually look at the government's own computer model of the collapse, that's exactly what it's doing. It's totally deforming. The sides of the outer walls are completely folding inwards, and it's this discombobulated mess. And what you actually see in the video is a very, very clean process. Standing still, snap of a finger, it goes down in free fall.
Wow. Okay. How close were other buildings? I mean, this is a dense area of Manhattan. How many other buildings were in close proximity to these twin towers? Because that would be kind of my first thought is, why did Building 7 collapse? I mean, weren't there a bunch of other skyscrapers around the twin towers that were maybe as close as Building 7 was? And why didn't they collapse then?
Yeah, so there were buildings that were actually closer than Building 7, buildings that were far more damaged, buildings that had much bigger fires inside of them, that didn't collapse, and that the authorities, frankly, were not all that concerned were going to collapse. Uh,
Hmm.
Very shortly after the Twin Towers came down, about 11:30 in the morning, the city officials, the fire department, Office of Emergency Management started saying, Building 7, we think that building is going to collapse. You know, there's a very high probability, or we're even certain that building is going to come down today. And they started getting everyone out of there. There's no reason to hone in on Building 7 as being a particular risk of coming down compared to the other structures that were nearby it and were actually closer to the towers.
And were these other structures nearby it, were they also steel framed or were they made out of concrete, or do we know the structure of those other buildings?
Yeah, I don't know the particulars of every building that was nearby, but you had World Trade Center 5 and 6, which were closer to the towers. They were, south of Building 7, in between Building 7 and the towers. I'm pretty sure those buildings are shorter. They're not as tall as
Right.
Building 7, but they're steel framed. You had other buildings surrounding the area, the World Financial buildings, World Financial Center on one side. You had the Deutsche Bank building. You had the Millennium Hotel. These are all pretty much steel frame buildings, I'm going to wager. And very severely damaged, many of them, some of them on fire. And, the authorities weren't all, I mean, of course, it's a dangerous area, but all the attention started going to Building 7 shortly after the towers came down. And for hours, they were predicting with certainty that Building
Yeah.
7 was going to come down.
I feel like I remember watching that in the news. I feel like in the news, even they were saying we're watching Building 7. I mean, it was a long time ago, but I'm trying to remember if that was. I kind of feel like, we saw the first one come down, then we saw the second one come down. And then I feel like there was a lot of chatter about Building 7. And that was how many hours later did that one come down?
About 7 hours later. So the first
Seven.
tower came down at 9:59, second one at 10:28, and then Building 7 at 5:20 in the afternoon.
Huh. Okay. Okay, so give us more evidence why you think it was then. So that's all interesting that they were honing in on Building 7, saying we're watching this one, we think this one's going to collapse, which you're right is not really normal. We see buildings light up on fire, we see earthquakes and disasters, and we're not really seeing buildings collapsing all the time, if ever. So and we've seen bombings like Oklahoma City bombing, right? That building did not collapse. Did that building collapse? The Oklahoma City. I don't think that went down. It had a big hole in it.
Part of yeah, it had a big hole. I think a large section of the building
Right.
was destroyed, but a lot of the building remained intact and standing.
Right. And that's, I think, what we're used to seeing when there's some sort of thing like this, like a bomb or an earthquake we see, or a fire, we see maybe part of the building collapse, but not the entire structure. Like you said, just like completely symmetrically falling down into the ground. Usually you'd see the face of it or some part of it and that would make more sense. So that right there is really, that's an interesting point. So what's some of the other evidence?
Yeah, I think that the other strongest evidence is in the debris of Building 7 as well as the towers. So in Building 7 in particular, they recovered several beams that had been completely melted through. Some of the professors that studied this steel called it, like Swiss cheese, right? And so I think we all generally know, you've probably heard it, that fire can't melt steel, right? So and that's the truth, it can't. And yet there was melted steel in Building 7, and it's never really been explained. And the report that was put out shortly in the first year after 9/11 talked about this steel that had undergone melting and sulfidation, they call it, and said we need to study this further. We really don't know why it happened. Then the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which then conducted the main official investigation over the next 6 years, they avoided looking at that piece of steel and never really answered the question. So you've got melted steel in the buildings. We know the fire can't do that. People have tried to say that sulfur from the wallboard, that's supposed to prevent fires from spreading, somehow got into the steel and caused this melting and this sulfidation. But that's chemically not possible for the sulfur to come from that material and go and melt the steel. So its simple explanation is that it's a material called thermate, which is thermite is like the basic material that you might have heard of. It lights up, it gets very hot, several thousand degrees, and can be used to melt steel. The sulfur indicates that it was something called thermate, which has sulfur mixed into the thermite. So you've got molten melted steel beams. You have dust from the World Trade Center site that has small, previously molten particles, iron microspheres in it, and we know because it's a small sphere that it was in a molten state at one point. And this material, these molten iron microspheres, make up 6% of the dust that's recovered from multiple samples of World Trade Center dust. And this is documented by several organizations such as USGS and RJ Lee. So you've got this evidence of extreme temperatures, both in Building 7 and the Twin Towers. And in case of Building 7, you also have eyewitness evidence of explosions going off throughout the day, starting in the morning, but continuing through the day. And in particular, when it goes down, there's several eyewitness accounts of a large explosion or seeing shock waves ripping through the building when the building starts to come down. And so, there's a New York One reporter, Gigi Stonewood, said we have a loud, incredibly loud explosion when Building 7 went down. And she's one of several eyewitnesses who've been documented saying it. Now, there's not as much eyewitness documentation evidence of explosions compared to the towers where we have hundreds, but there's a handful in the case of Building 7.
Interesting. So what is the theory then? Was it one, when I think of a controlled demolition of buildings that have been taken down, it's a bunch of explosions that are happening all at once, and then we see the building come down. So in this case, what's the theory then, that these explosions were going off throughout the day, just like one by one until the thing collapsed? Or like, because you would think there would be a lot of eyewitnesses to a lot of explosions and then the building coming down. And that would be the most obvious, proof of controlled demolition.
Yeah, so it's a great question. As far as earlier in the day, why there were explosions then, first of all, the eyewitness evidence comes from at least two guys named Barry Jennings and Michael Hess, who worked for the city of New York. Michael Hess was the corporation counsel at that time. They reported a huge explosion in Building 7 as they were trying to evacuate the building. This was probably between the collapse of the two towers. I think that, and there was also descriptions of a huge amount of damage inside the core of the building, of elevator shafts being, ejected from the elevator cars being ejected from the shafts and so on, which couldn't really happen from debris from the North Tower hitting, the south side of the building. So you've got eyewitness accounts of explosions and huge damage inside in the very interior of the building earlier on in the day. And then, you do have people reporting explosions throughout the day. Scott Pelley, I think he was with CBS or ABC. One of those is one example. There's a clip of him saying, you hear explosions every 15 or 20 minutes when you're down there. You've got a video clip of workers that are walking away from Building 7. You can hear an explosion in the distance. Someone says, you hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It's going to be coming down soon. And then you have several people hearing explosions, as it comes down. Now, my guess is that they wanted this, whoever did this wanted this to look like a natural building collapse. As far as it happening in the morning, I wanted to say it may have been intended for this building to go down in the morning, and something went wrong to go down shortly after or like when the second tower went down, and something went wrong, and that's why you had that big explosion in the building, but then nothing happens throughout the day. But so fast forward to later in the day, you hear lots of explosions. I would suspect that if you want to make it look like a natural building collapse, you don't want to bring too much attention to the explosions. That's in part why you also use thermite or thermate to cut a lot of the steel framing, so that you don't have to use as much explosive force. And there's ways to, there's sound abatement techniques that can be used as well to keep those explosions from being so loud or from traveling so far, the sound of them. So it may not have been as loud as a typical demolition, where they're not trying to hide the fact that it was demolition, but nonetheless, there were explosions that were heard by many witnesses.
What is the official narrative about those sounds? How do they explain it?
Yeah, I mean, the official narrative, it's interesting. First of all, they do this analysis that says, if you were to detonate enough RDX to sever one of these columns, it would create this level of sound. I think they say 130, 140 decibels. And we don't have any eyewitnesses reporting sounds that loud. Well, you actually do have eyewitnesses that reported what they called explosions or claps of thunder or shock waves ripping through the building, right? But they're not sitting there saying, oh, I know it was 140 decibels. Right. So it's this weird artificial threshold that NIST, the government agency, and they basically ignore these eyewitness accounts. We actually, the organization I was with before, had a back and forth with NIST, where we were trying to get them to correct their report through this formal process called a request for correction. And we actually discovered a new witness, a footage that we hadn't seen before. I mentioned her before, Gigi Stone-Woods, who said the building, it was a very loud explosion, and I made contact with her, and she affirmed her story, and she's, and then I tried to get NIST to interview her, and they refused. So they're blocking out the evidence, any evidence that doesn't fit their story.
Right. Could the explosions have been something else? I mean, could it be that, as the building, as the structure started to collapse, in one part, and you hear this like because it's the inside is collapsing, and then another part, because the inside is, still collapsing on steel, and part of the building that would, I would imagine, make a really loud sound. Is it possible that the explosions were not explosions, but just parts of the building collapsing on the inside?
Based on the eyewitness accounts, the distance that these people were from the building, Gigi Stone Woods, who I mentioned, she was, I don't know, half a kilometer away. Other people were far away. Craig Bartmer is a police officer who reported hearing these explosions running away. I don't think that just falling beams is going to make that sound. I think you also have to zoom out and say, wait, this, first of all, let's start with the fact that this looks like a controlled demolition. So for it to not be a controlled demolition, like we should be looking, there has to be overwhelming evidence that it's not a
Right.
controlled demolition. It's actually a natural building collapse. And all the evidence that I've run through with you, it all points to demolition, and so, um,
But
we can pick at each.
wouldn't we have found evidence of explosives?
We would have if we had tested for it. NIST specifically did not test for explosives. They said we don't need to test for explosives, or we don't need to test for residues of thermite because we know it's not there. There's literally a quote from NIST saying that.
But
And
wouldn't you
so,
find, like some parts of bombs maybe in the rubble?
not, yeah, not well, no, yeah, no. Again, well, most of the rubble was destroyed. A very, very, very small number of steel members from Building 7 were actually saved. Right, that's the first thing. Most of that was destroyed within weeks. Building 7, the debris was gone, so there's no rubble to look through. Why was it taken away so quickly? Why was it destroyed? Why was it melted down? That's a really good question. So yeah, you're not going to find it when you don't have anything to test. Furthermore, as I said, if you wanted to, I think there's ways to do this. If you're demolishing a building and you don't want people to know that it was demolished, you can do it in a way to conceal, the remains of some of these materials or these devices, you know. But the biggest problem is that the debris was hauled away and was never actually properly examined.
Okay, so what are some of the experts saying about that? Is there more evidence that you wanted to share about that before we get into some of what the experts are saying?
Yeah, I mean, I could get into a whole host of evidence about the Twin Towers if you want to go there. But I can also talk about what experts are saying about building 7. So what
Yeah, I
would
want
you
to I
like to
want to
talk
stick
about?
with building 7 first, and then we'll move on to the
Okay.
towers. But what are the experts saying about building 7? I mean, it seems that there would be, I mean, I've watched, before talking to you, I watched many videos of people debunking this idea that building 7 was taken down with a controlled demolition. And they say we have hundreds of architects and engineers and experts who say, no, this is just really the official narrative is what happened. The debris caused building 7 to catch fire, and it lost structural integrity and it collapsed. And that's just what it is. So
Right.
have you talked to many experts who say, yeah, that is what it is, and then other experts who say, no, that's not what it is?
I've occasionally talked to engineers or people you might call experts who support the official story. I think when you ask what are experts saying about it, the funny thing is that there's actually multiple theories, fire-based theories about how the building came down. So NIST that I mentioned, that's only one theory. Somebody else has another theory. Firms that worked in a lawsuit between Silverstein Properties and Con Edison have competing theories about how fires caused the buildings to collapse. You've got another group that has a different theory. So there's actually not one theory. And one of the people who's put out these theories has wrote a paper commenting on the fact that there's actually no agreement and saying, we're never going to actually know how Building 7 came down. So if you can't settle on one theory, that means none of these people have seen evidence that in their mind confirms their theory or another group's theory. There's
Right.
and they're all, I have to say, they're all incredibly speculative. Most of them many of them just focus on the initial initiating failure and don't go as far as modeling the entire collapse or trying to explain that free fall symmetrical descent that I spoke about. So you actually don't have a theory that has any sort of consensus. And if there was strong evidence that any of these theories was correct, they would all
Right.
gravitate to that one theory, right?
Right. And they
On the
would
other
say, well,
side,
this is what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have that. And you got them saying, we'll never know what happened, you know, and on the other side, you have a very simple theory that's supported by thousands of engineers and architects and people, scientists, people, and you know, who know, I think there's probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of experts out there who know that Building 7 was brought down by controlled demolition because it's obvious and because there's not any overwhelming evidence contradicting it.
So let's talk about the Twin Towers themselves then. I mean, we all watched the plane, many of us, those of us old enough, watched the planes fly right into those buildings on the news. Some people were even there in person. Then we saw, you know, a plane fly into the Pentagon and another plane in a field. What is the, so I mean, I would imagine planes striking towers like that would cause a significant amount of damage and that it's reasonable to believe that it would cause them to collapse, I suppose. I'm not an engineer. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is to just look at the videos, look at the videos closely, and what you're actually looking at is not a building collapsing, not the top of the building starting to fall, lose support, and you know break each floor below it successively. What you're actually seeing is the entire building being blown up. It's explosively disintegrating. All of the concrete of the buildings was, in a matter of seconds, converted to powder. You know, it was completely pulverized. The steel structure was completely blown apart. And if you just really take a good look at that video evidence, and the top of the building actually disintegrates within a few seconds. Okay, and you're not, from that point, the building is just each floor by floor sort of exploding outwards, right, hundreds of feet in all directions, and you're not seeing a top that's coming here and crushing each thing below it. All right, so you have to kind of start and ask yourself, what am I actually seeing here? And there's a very good video that you can find right on our homepage that's called More Exploding. That
It's
really
called what?
shows you.
Sorry. What's your
It's called,
homepage and what's
yeah. So it's ic911.org, just 5
okay.
characters, ic911.
And
And if
and
you look at
the
the video,
yeah, where is it?
if you scroll down a little bit and you look at the video that's pertaining to the Twin Towers,
Okay.
if you click that video, it plays a video called North Tower Exploding, which shows you the
Okay.
same clip over and over again and sort of analyzes what you're actually seeing there, right?
Yeah, okay.
Um,
Okay.
and so what you are seeing again, as I said, is not a collapsing building. It's really an exploding building. Beyond that, when you're talking about the motion a little further, if you and this has been measured by engineers and scientists, if you look at how quickly the top section, in particular the North Tower, because it's easier to measure, the top section, when it starts to fall, it just constantly accelerates at almost the rate of free fall. And this is one of the first things that struck me when I started studying it, was if it were actually breaking the structure below it, at each floor that it hit, it would actually slow down a little bit. It would decelerate, right? And you don't actually see that in the measurements. It just continuously accelerates and never slows down. And
Right.
at the same time, you have this massive amount of material, concrete, steel that's being broken apart and pulverized. And so how do you get the top that's falling so rapidly which means there's almost no resistance whatsoever, and yet this massive destruction of materials, you can't have it both ways, both falling at almost free fall and this massive destruction of materials. The only thing that can reconcile those two sets of motions, the downward motion of the top and the destructive outward motion of the lower structure, is that
Hmm.
explosives is destroying all of it. So
Uh,
I like to
kind
focus
of,
on the dynamics. hmm
yeah, remind us when these towers came down, was there anything left of them were some of the lower floors still remaining?
Yeah, so in the case of the North Tower, you had 90 stories of intact steel structure below it. In the case of the South Tower, you had, I don't know, about 65 stories of intact hard steel structure below it. So most of these buildings were perfectly intact and not damaged at all.
No, but I mean after they collapsed. Was there
After they
anything left of
collapsed,
these
yes,
buildings? After they collapsed, there
nothing,
was still no, there was nothing. Okay. So you're saying
nothing. The
that
steel,
there was 90 stories and 60 something stories. That's after the planes hit. That's what you're talking about. That's because the holes were at the
yeah,
top of the towers. And you're saying
Exactly.
that the remaining tower was fine. And that makes sense. It makes sense. Like, why wouldn't the top just collapse? And then it would still leave, you would think that it wouldn't collapse the entire building. Because how could the entire building lose that much structural integrity if the top collapses onto the
Yeah,
bottom?
you're
Because there
asking the
wasn't
right
as much
question.
top, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it would make more sense if it was lower and there was more up above than below, and then that one starts crumbling because the structural damage happened lower. But we saw the structural damage happen towards the top of these towers. There was a lot of tower left, and yet so you're saying after they collapsed, there was absolutely nothing. They were collapsed all the way down to the ground, both buildings.
Yeah, and I would say yes, they were blown up all the way down to the ground. You're
Right, but
asking the right question. How would a little top section destroy the 90 stories below it? The
right,
answer is that it wouldn't. We know from calculations that if that top had actually begun to fall and lose support from a natural weakening, that
right.
collapse would arrest within a few seconds because the lower structure was actually strong enough to withstand that dynamic force from the top coming down. And again, look at the videos and you just see that thing start to fall and it just keeps accelerating almost at the rate of
Right.
free fall. And then if you look closely and if you look at the right footage, you can see huge explosions shooting outwards in kind of symmetrically in all directions. And we're supposed to believe that that is somehow being caused by air pressure from the top falling and pushing air out, right? But these are massive explosions, almost the length of the building itself, and they're full of pulverized material. Which, if it was just
Yeah.
air being pushed out, it would just be air. But we've got pulverized material that's being ejected out, around 100 feet a second or so. So, yeah, just I encourage people to just take a good look at the video footage and use common sense and some critical thinking and ask yourself, what am I seeing here?
Right.
There's also lots of chemical evidence. I started to mention it before.
Yeah.
You actually, in the case of the South Tower, you have molten metal pouring out of the corner of the South Tower for 7 minutes continuously right before the South Tower starts to collapse. And that was the first tower of the two to come down. You've got molten metal pouring out. There's many different video clips of it. NIST, the government agency that investigated it, had to talk about it because it was documented. It was seen by a lot of people, and they tried to say that it was molten aluminum from the airplanes. But if it was molten aluminum, it would have a silvery appearance at the temperature that it would have reached. What you actually see is bright yellow hot molten metal that's really gushing out of the South Tower for 7 minutes before it comes down. This is basically a thermite device that, for whatever reason, and there were little mistakes that happened here. It didn't go off without a hitch. This was a little mistake. This thermite device started ejecting molten metal building. So you've got that. You've got actual nanothermite. Scientists have discovered nanothermite, unreacted nanothermite in the dust in multiple independent samples of World Trade Center dust. So we've got one of the actual mechanisms of destroying this building. We've found it and it's at an engineered thermite at the nano level.
So all three of these buildings collapsed to the ground. There was nothing remaining of any of the three after they collapsed?
Nothing remaining. Yeah. If you want to dig into one very interesting but important detail, in the case of both towers, there was actually a large core section that remained standing in the latter seconds of the collapses. And what the North Towers is the most obvious. I can send you video footage if you want to show it. If that core section there tells us, that's almost 60 stories high, tells us that the top did not stay intact and continue all the way down and crush everything below it. Because if the top had done that, it would have gone through and broken those 60 stories of core structure. And yet that core structure just stands there. It tells us that the top actually disintegrated and wasn't doing anything to the rest of the structure. And so then you've got waves of explosions breaking the structure apart. The core stands there, and then the core drops about 10 seconds later, just drops straight down, which again, that doesn't make any sense why it would just drop symmetrically straight down. So to answer your question, there was a little bit of the towers remaining in the first 10 seconds after main collapse. But then after that, there was nothing. It was all broken apart. Almost all the concrete was totally pulverized. The steel frames were completely shattered, and into small pieces and spread hundreds of feet in all directions. One of the saddest things is that most of the human bodies were also pulverized to very small pieces. 40% of the victims in the towers, their bodies, no trace of their bodies has been identified. No trace. If this were a natural building collapse, you would have some identifiable body part of pretty much every person who was in those buildings. And yet 40% of the victims, over 1,100, still have not been identified because their bodies were pulverized.
So when you take all of this evidence to an independent expert, engineers, architects, or whatever, what do they give you a counter theory? Do they say, no, it really, planes could have caused this and fiery debris could have caused building 7? I mean, are there, the majority of the people you talk to, what percentage tells you, no, the official narrative is accurate?
I would say a lot of the people that we bring this to already agree, are already aware of it. There's people that we bring it to who say, no, 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 no. You usually find in those cases that those people don't know what they're talking about. They haven't really studied the government reports either, but they haven't looked at all the evidence. And when they start countering, they often have these ideas that are, totally out of left field, that are not even a part of the official narrative of how the buildings collapsed. So they're sort of grasping at straws. You have a few, very, very tiny people who've studied this closely, who I would say strongly adhere to the official story. And I tend to think those people are just kind of fooling themselves. You people that were actually a part of the investigation, and my sense is, that they were lying through their teeth, and they know it, and they were probably in a position where they felt they had to, support the official narrative, and sadly, produce this fraudulent reports about how the buildings came down.
Some of the people who've shared the ideas that you have, that these were controlled demolitions, some of the experts, engineers and architects, if they've come public with that, have they been somehow demonized? Are their careers ruined? Have there been consequences for people that say, I don't think, experts who say, I don't believe that the official narrative is accurate?
Yeah. So by and large, I haven't heard that many examples of people sort of their, having a setback in their career, or being fired or what have you, because they've come out and spoken out about this. The experts that tend to come out and question the official story, like they tend to be people who, maybe have less to lose. Maybe they're very comfortable in their position, or they work at a smaller firm, so they don't have to worry about what the higher ups say because they're a sole proprietor, or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say it's harder to find engineers who work in large firms, who, or the engineers who are building the tallest high rises in the world, come out and question this, because those folks have a lot more to lose. I think, and that's how that is. But fortunately, not too many people have had faced any sort of repercussions because they've spoken out about this. And so I think a lot more probably could, and would, the same thing would happen to them. They'd be all right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about now who did this. So if you think it's controlled demolition, then somebody was obviously involved in this. Who would have been able to do this? I mean, this seems that you'd have to have people that could get into these buildings and set up the bombs. And I would imagine that they were not done the day of. I would imagine that this was done well in advance, would be my guess. That this is something that you would plan out. I mean, we obviously know the attacks themselves were planned out. So potentially as part of those attacks, maybe those same people went and were able to somehow get into these buildings and plant bombs all over the place. And, they were planning this, who knows how far in advance, maybe even years in advance before this. So they could have been doing it throughout a long period of time. So do you have any sense of who did this?
I don't have any strong sense of who, like individuals, in part because I'm focused on studying and educating people about the scientific evidence that it was controlled demolition. And I think that what we need is an investigation to get to the bottom of who did it. But a lot of good things have been written over the years and produced. I think you have to start with, well, who controlled access to those buildings. So in that case, you're talking about the security firms that worked in the towers. Stratesec is one. The Kroll Associates is a security firm that advised in the renovation of the buildings after the bombing in '93, and which continued to be involved in the security at the World Trade Center until 2001. So the reasonable place to start investigating is there. You look clearly. You're going to look at the ownership of the buildings as well, and so that until mid 2001, that was the Port Authority, and then it changed hands. It was Silverstein acquired a lease on the towers in mid 2001, and then I think you have to look at who might have the expertise. And we're not talking about that many groups, the expertise and the materials. When we're talking about this kind of nanothermite, and I'll say the obvious. We're talking about maybe a handful of demolition firms in the world who could do this, and maybe it's less likely that it was them, and it's more likely that it was, some sort of, I'll say, branch of the military or some foreign military that knows how to demolish structures as well. So that's where you start. Bigger picture, you could talk about who the air defense failures, the hijackings, the alleged hijackers and their connections to Saudi officials. Recently, uncovered CIA connections as well, and so on. So there's a lot more to the puzzle than just the destruction of the buildings and who would have made that happen. But what I mentioned is a starting point. So
Got it. So you don't have any. You're not focused at all on the who, or even the why. You're just focused on the fact that the narrative that these buildings just collapsed on their own because of structural damage from these planes hitting them and debris, flying fiery debris. You're saying that the science there is just not there for that. And that is what you really want to focus on. And you want them to investigate that.
Yeah, to be fair, that's what I have focused on over the years. I was with a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth for 8 years, and that's what I focused on. With this organization, the International Center for 9/11 Justice, we are actually very interested in the who and the why. And
Yeah.
a fair amount has been written on that over the years, and that's actually where we want to push our investigation, our research in the coming years, is more so in the who and why. Like at this point, we're looking to the evidence of controlled demolition is well established. We want to push the focus of our research and the general public towards finding out more things about the who and the why. I think that's where this needs to go now. But I think in broad strokes, I think that we know that 9/11, we know what happened after 9/11. It launched the war on terror. It was,
Right.
led the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and so on, and trillions of dollars of defense spending, the massive expansion of the national security state, and all of that, and the erosion of civil liberties, and so I think, in my mind, I think that those outcomes, in my personal opinion, that was what 9/11 was largely about. It was a false flag attack that was intended to primarily launch the war on terror. I think that can be really hard for a lot of people to come to that conclusion or that realization. So that's why I encourage hopefully starting with the forensic evidence, and trying to be open-minded about that, but then also saying, what, did I like that we went to war in Iraq? No. Did I like that we, started this war on terror that created, decades of perpetual war? No.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe go back and say, hey, if we actually got to the bottom of what 9/11 was, maybe we could actually bring an end to all those policies that were started after 9/11 that we don't like very much.
Right. Right. I just knowing what I know about foreign policy, I would look at the likely suspects to me. If I were to say who I know a lot of people want to point to the U.S. government. I do think that there maybe were some failures inside of the U.S. government, maybe even some complicity. But the people that actually benefited the most from 9/11 was Saudi Arabia and Israel. They had absolutely the most to gain from the war on terror that the U.S. was very reluctant to get into. After the first Gulf War, And there's definitely, the only thing that's going to motivate the American people to really go to war ourselves, to send our own troops in more than anything it would have to be some sort of an attack on Americans. That's how we got into World War II. It took Pearl Harbor. So, but prior to that, Americans said, well, we'll give you some support, we'll wish you luck, but we're not getting into World War II. And maybe the same thing with the Gulf War. We saw how politically damaging it was for the first Bush. You don't win elections again. People have to really rally around you. So it seems to me that Saudi Arabia and Israel would have the most to gain by destabilizing the rest of the Middle East and ensuring that they remain the biggest and boldest powers in the region. And they were allies of ours. So that is easy then to trust maybe security contractors from these countries, lots of people, just allowing them into the country to train, or CIA joining them up with the CIA for training. We're seeing all of that, and that makes a lot of sense when it's people that are on our side, supposedly on our side, and then potentially they were doing something that really, because really countries, this whole notion that, oh, they're our friends, they would never do this to us. No, countries look out for themselves first, and they will absolutely turn on their friends if it benefits them, because they have to. That's their job, is to look out for their people and themselves first. It would be nice if the U.S. government did that for us. They seem to not. But so that would be my idea, especially with knowing about the dancing Israelis that were monitoring the Twin Towers the day before and then cheering and dancing around after they were hit and collapsing. And then they were questioned briefly and then allowed to leave. There's a lot of inconsistencies that I think we need to be definitely exploring on this. But, the implications, so let's talk about why they haven't been investigating this. Let's say, whether it be, because I know tell me what percentage of the people in the community that you're in, what percentage of them think the U.S. government is directly responsible for this, not just tangentially like I think, or what percentage of them think it's like Saudi Arabia and Israel, or just Saudi Arabia or just Israel? What percentage would you say are in each camp?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to know because sometimes the certain voices are louder than others, even though percentage might be higher in one direction than another.
Right.
I would wager that like 80 to 90% probably think that the U.S. government was primarily responsible. And you said it first, that Israel and Saudi Arabia were involved, but
Right.
were helping. It certainly did further their interests. I would say there's a small but vocal contingent that believes that Israel was primarily responsible. In my view, I don't think that you're going to get away. I don't think that you can't manage to pull this entire thing off, completely paralyze the air defenses, manage the hijackings, because, and I'll be very clear about this, those alleged hijackers could not have piloted those targets and managed to successfully. They couldn't have made the hijackings happen at that success rate of all four planes, and they couldn't have gotten to the towers, and they would not have been able to, and the Pentagon, and they would not have been able to steer them into those buildings. So somehow the hijackings were managed, the lack of air defense was managed, and that couldn't have all been done by Israel, frankly.
I don't know. Have you ever flown to Israel? Have you ever flown into the country?
No, I haven't. I haven't.
Okay, it's a real unique experience going through special Israeli security that they make you go through in the United States. They have set up in the U.S. like you go through an airport and you go through regular security. Well, the Israelis have an additional layer of security that you have to go through before you fly into their country after you've already gone through TSA. So you're inside the airport, you're fine. But then once you're going to go to the wing where the plane's going to go to Israel, they put you through a level of security that we do not have. It is unmatched here in the United States. And then flying into Israel, before you even get there, about 30 minutes before you land, suddenly the pilot comes on the air and he's like, we've just entered Israeli airspace. Nobody can stand up anymore. Like, you cannot go to the bathroom. We're locking the bathrooms. If you dare stand up, we are rerouting this plane to another place. And you're basically, everybody is, it's not going to be good. They're just the level of security that they have in their country. And even before entering their country, I would say that they're the best in the world. I think they absolutely could have. I don't think they did it by themselves. I mean, just in my theory, just from what I've seen. But
Mhm.
I think they're absolutely capable. I think they're very capable. They're the best in the
Of
world.
I hear you on the level of defense and security that they may well be, but to completely subvert the U.S. Defense apparatus, over U.S. soil and U.S. skies, for me that's hard to believe. And I think that when you dig into the evidence and the actual actions or inactions by U.S. government officials on the day of 9/11, you start to see that there must have been a high level of U.S. government complicity as well. Quickly on the Saudi Arabia question,
Yeah.
in the mainstream, there's this idea that Saudi Arabia is our ally, but some feisty officials who don't like the U.S. like got involved in helping these hijackers get to where they needed to go and blah blah blah. And I don't think that narrative holds any water. And I think we saw that with this recent document that was released. That two of the hijackers in San Diego were brought into a CIA operation. And so
Yeah.
what we're really looking at here is that the CIA and Saudi intelligence and Israeli intelligence, and possibly British, I wouldn't rule it out either,
Yeah. Right.
work very closely. Our interests align. Our foreign policy interests align for the most part, and I think probably was a joint operation, but I don't think that, in my view, it doesn't happen without U.S. Leading the charge. Sadly.
Yeah, it's hard for it, and that's I think where it's difficult. I mean, I even have a hard time with that, and I know about all the false flags that the United States has pulled off and done, and definitely a warmongering military-industrial complex. There's no doubt about that. I just have a tough time thinking that they actually would attack, that they would agree or even plan an attack on American citizens on American soil. I think in my mind, it's just hard for me to grasp that. I think it's more likely that they turned a blind eye, knowing that, or they were just duped by smarter groups that were, because before 9/11, we didn't have all the security. So I think it's a lot easier. I mean, back then you could greet people at the gate when they're coming off the planes. And, it was a different world, and we have to remember that different world. And so I don't think U.S. security was all that great at that time. Now it's much better, or much more, it's insane. It's still insane that we're still doing all the things that we're doing to get onto a plane and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know. So I think that's where a lot of people maybe get lost in all of this, because I think that many of us could go along with, okay, the narrative is not what they're telling us, but it's hard for me to then say the U.S. government did this to us.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that's,
yeah, I want to, and I want to like zoom out. Let me clarify and say, when I say, it was a U.S. operation, I don't mean that a large portion of the Pentagon, or of the CIA or the U.S. government broadly was involved in this. I think we're talking about a relatively small number of people.
okay,
And
that's more
in
believable
my
to
view,
me, for sure. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think it, is it maybe a couple hundred, maybe somewhere in that ballpark, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. I think people are
I
involved
would say
in sort of
less.
compartmentalized, say maybe
Yeah.
less, and people are
Yeah.
involved in compartmentalized ways. And I think when you look at the very highest ranking officials in the U.S., just these people tend to be sociopaths. Like, these people
Right.
tend to not really care, to not have any compassion. And I actually have no trouble believing the moral depravity of a lot of these people. What's a little harder to believe is that they could manage to do it and get away with it, and that they'd have the
Right.
audacity to try, and the
Right.
ability to cover it up, which I think that's the cover up is almost harder than the operation itself. That's the more surprising thing. But I've been astonished to see that that's what's happened over the last 20, 21 years, is that they did it, and they some people, and I can't say exactly which individuals, but they did it and they got away with it, and they apparently knew that they could, or they wouldn't have tried.
Well, and it makes sense if they believe, if the people involved in the U.S. government, if they believed that this is for the security of the country, like we're facing a bigger threat if we don't do this, like this is the thing that we need to do in order to wage the war, because if we don't, there's a much larger, so we just have to sacrifice a few for the greater good. People tend to think that way. I mean, there's definitely sociopaths amongst us, but a lot of times they think, no, I'm a patriot and I am doing what is necessary. And maybe the people can't swallow this, and so we're not going to be honest with them about this. But I know I'm doing it for the right reasons people have to tell themselves that. Most people don't think, I'm doing something bad because I'm a bad person, right? They think I'm doing this because I'm doing something helpful. And, we've seen, look, the CIA now we know most likely offed our own sitting American president of JFK. And so, there's a lot, the country's certainly capable of a lot of stuff, especially if they believe they're doing it for some good reason. Like, we must do this or else this will happen. So, that is definitely believable. And the fact that there's been no investigation. Okay, so now let's get to the investigation part, because you're asking for an investigation into this. But what is there to investigate? The buildings are gone. They have new things there. Like, how could you possibly prove any of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think I think that it would not be hard to quickly reach a conclusion that the buildings were actually demolished. Like, if you had some sort of independent scientific panel and, involving engineers, scientists, et cetera, like, that's the easy part, is showing that it was controlled demolition. The hard part then is to figure out the who and the how and so on. So when I talk about
Right.
having investigation, I'm not like, we don't need to do like several more years of asking, oh, was it a natural building collapse or was it a controlled demolition? So I think the hard part is to figure out the who. But if you would need a groundswell of public support for this type of investigation to happen. Like, you would need,
Right.
broad-based realization and belief that the Twin Towers were blown up, and that the official story of 9/11 is untrue, and therefore we want our government to go and investigate this. And then you have to have fearless investigators at the Justice Department and so on, and getting all the bad guys, that ain't going to be easy, and it would be very prone to sort of a limited hangout type of situation. So you need huge support and skepticism from the public to ensure that the investigation actually starts to uncover some of the real culprits. So that's what we're looking for. So I think you can do an investigation into that at this point. I think a lot of these people are still alive. Probably most of them are still alive. And I think
I don't
it's
think you're going
hard
to get an
until somebody.
investigation until the war on terror ends, which it doesn't seem to be ending, until the people that benefited from this, it's like you're not going to get the investigation until the benefits stop. And at this point, the benefits are still there for the people that benefited from this, from all the
Yeah.
players that we mentioned. So until those
Well,
benefits stop, well, and really also when those benefits, not only do they need to stop, but they would need to become detrimental to the American people. So it would have to be where Saudi Arabia becomes an enemy of the United States and Israel becomes like no longer our best friend, right? Like maybe the alignments shift, and we're maybe seeing that now. I mean, we're seeing maybe Saudi Arabia cozying up with China. Israel's kind of like, we like Russia and America. We're not really willing to pick a side. So it's possible that in maybe 20 years, when the alliances shift and the U.S. is angry, that there maybe then would be, okay, now we're willing to tell the truth about what happened, or we're willing to investigate. They would still never implicate themselves for as long as this government is the way this government is, unless we had like a serious reform. They're not going to admit it, but they certainly maybe would point the finger at their friends, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and like you said, a limited hangout, not go after the U.S. We'll just we'll just let these others hang out to dry, but not anybody in the U.S. government. That's maybe that's the only time I could see that happening. Otherwise, the implications are too large. I mean, just like with the JFK assassination, we're not getting a real investigation into that that's honest and truthful. We're not getting all the documents from the CIA. Why? Because the implications are too great. So,
yeah.
I mean, they
Well,
would kill
I
you
hold on.
before they really release any of this, would be my thought. And
Would you
are
say
you
what was the
afraid
last
of
thing you said?
that? Yeah, they would kill you
Well,
before they allow any of this.
yeah.
And I mean, are you afraid of that?
I mean, right now, I think as much as I would like to be more of a threat to the people that perpetrated this, right now, me and my little organization may not be. Although we're trying to turn the tide here. So who knows? Maybe in a few years, and until I feel like we're gaining some real traction and we maybe are more of a threat. I'm not too concerned about it, and I'm putting those concerns aside and just doing what I think is the right thing to do. I think that in terms of that real investigation thing, yeah, I mean, there's going to be incredible force against that, but to get there the only way that any type of investigation happens is if there is as I said before, massive groundswell, 80, 90% of the country, it just becomes widespread knowledge or belief that, 9/11 was some type of inside job, that the towers were blown up. And so that, government officials, elected officials have no choice but to push vigorously to get to the bottom of how it happened. And so it really is, it's a deep reckoning type of situation. It's not like oh, we think there might be more here. We got it. Somebody got to do an investigation. Okay, we'll set up this. FBI is going to look into it, or we'll set up this little congressional committee. Like, no, I think it would be a massive, like, profound reckoning. That fuels a new investigation, and that investigation actually goes somewhere, because enough people are up in arms and realize that the official story is wrong, that they were lied to.
You
That's
you
my
might
hope
end up
anyway.
getting that out of the younger generation. Those of us that lived through 9/11, I mean, they told us the story. We lived through the terror of it. They told us the story. And I think people that lived through it, that are old enough to have, we were adults when this happened. I was an adult when this happened. So I think those of us that are in that camp, it might be tougher to sway because we were fed, and then there was a war, and we saw people in our age group at that time, especially, in their 20s or whatever, rushing to the military, joining to fight and defend the United States. They saw mass recruitment during that time. It was a time that French fries were freedom fries, right? like we lived through this. I think, though, the younger generation that didn't really live through it, they didn't. Maybe they were too young to fully understand it. They're just now learning about it in the history books. I think as they age into adulthood and they start looking at it, they're the ones who are most likely to be skeptical of the narrative, because they're also fed up with the wars on terror. And they're like, oh, yeah, right, you people have been keeping us in endless war forever. So they're more likely. And do you find that? Do you find that the younger generation, because that's, in my experience about 9/11, the younger people seem to say, I don't know, that whole thing seems weird to me. Like, that doesn't really quite add
Yeah,
up.
yeah. I think in general, on average, younger people are much more open minded about it than older people.
Yeah.
Older generations. And I was 19. I just moved to New York City 2 weeks before 9/11. It was basically my introduction to the city, and was part of my experience there during my formative years, of my
Yeah.
life. Um, but yeah, I think older people were traumatized by it, and they were, and oftentimes change happens not because people change their minds, but through attrition. Older generations just get older and pass on, and so on, and younger generations come up. I would like, at the same time, younger people might be more open minded, but they might have less of an emotional connection to it. And so if you want that drive
Right.
to say, like, no, we got to get to the bottom of this, it might be a combination of older people who are really emotionally, connected to 9/11, uh, uh, turning around and saying, "Oh, we were lied to." So maybe
Yeah.
maybe you get that passion from the older generations, and you get the open mindedness from younger generations, kind of mixing together. You know, that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, I definitely think the younger generations for sure are going to be way more open to this. And so you may end up getting this investigation at some point, but I think it might take 20 more years, at least 10 to 20, at least 10, if not 20 more years for that younger generation to age up, and for the boomers to, they're not, if they're no longer around. But those of us, I was in my 20s when this happened, and it was traumatizing for, no matter how it happened, or who did it, how the towers came down. The whole thing was traumatic for the whole nation, for those of us old enough to understand what was happening. And obviously the topic of conversation every day. And it was like it was like the COVID pandemic, right? I mean, it was like that strong of an experience for us, and that traumatizing for many of us. So, just wondering, are we next? Is my city going to be? Are we still under attack? What's going to happen? I mean, just that fear. So I definitely think you'll eventually get this investigation. I would love to see it happen sooner than later for sure, because there's definitely a lot of inconsistencies, and you've pointed out a lot. You've made a lot of really good points. I've never really looked into this. I've never really paid much attention to the towers and how they collapsed. I've never really bought the official narrative either, because we see what they've done with it. We've seen the years, decades of what they've done, how they've taken advantage of this. So I think many of us are very skeptical of this narrative, and really appreciate you coming on and giving us a more eye-opening experience about this and educating us about this. I definitely am going to be perusing your website a bit more and looking, watching the videos and seeing more. So that is ic911.org. Definitely going to look at that. So thank you so much for being here and for talking to us about this. And, I hopefully this doesn't come with a bunch of consequences for you being somebody that's speaking out quite a bit. Hopefully people aren't. I'm sure they are labeling you a big conspiracy theorist, but you know what? That's par for the course. Join the club. We're all called conspiracy theorists these days.
Actually, but yeah, and most people I talk to these days in my local community, when I tell another parent, what I do, like 9 out of 10 times they're at least open-minded, if not actually
Yeah.
totally in agreement. So I think that there's a shift underway. And
Yeah.
I thank you for having me on the show and for taking a good look at this, the collapse of the towers, for the first time. And thank you. I really commend you, and it was a
Thank
pleasure to be
you.
on.
Thank you for being here. Well, that's it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for watching. Again, a reminder, we are not doing a show tomorrow. It is the 4th of July, and we are off. So we will be back Wednesday. Really hope you have a great 4th. I hope you look at lots of fireworks and have a barbecue and do all of the fun things that you would maybe be doing on the 4th of July. So go have fun. We're going to have fun, and we will see you back Wednesday night. Thank you so much for joining us. Until Wednesday, have a great night. Happy holiday.